The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The young prince had always been observant, but today something felt different. His eyes kept drifting toward the tall, stoic figure of Royal Guard Thomas Whitman, who stood at attention near the castle's main entrance. Thomas had been stationed at this very spot for nearly 15 years. His red uniform was immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his expression remained neutral despite the curious tourists who often tried to make him smile or react. To most people, Thomas was simply part of the scenery, as permanent and unchanging as the ancient stones of the castle itself. But Prince George noticed something others missed. During their daily walks, he had begun to see the subtle signs that Thomas was struggling. The slight tremor in his hands during the changing of the guard ceremony, the way his shoulders sagged just a fraction when he thought no one was looking, the tired lines around his eyes that seemed deeper each passing week. Queen Elizabeth had taught her great-grandson to observe people carefully, to understand that everyone carried burdens that weren't always visible. A true leader, she had told him, sees not just what people show but what they try to hide. These words echoed in George's young mind as he watched Thomas day after day. The guard's personal struggles had begun 2 years earlier when his wife Sarah was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. At 52, she had started forgetting simple things, then important things, and finally she stopped recognizing Thomas altogether. Their savings had been depleted by medical bills and specialized care facilities. Thomas worked double shifts whenever possible, standing guard during the day and taking security jobs at night to pay for Sarah's treatment. His colleagues knew something was wrong but respected his privacy too much to pry. Thomas had always been the strong one, the reliable one who never complained. He carried himself with the same dignity, whether he was protecting royalty or dealing with personal tragedy. But the weight of watching his beloved wife disappear piece by piece was slowly crushing him. Prince George didn't know the specific details of Thomas's situation, but his young heart sensed the pain. During their morning walk, George asked his grandmother, "Why does Mr. Whitman look so sad sometimes?" The Queen paused, considering her response carefully. She had noticed the same thing but hadn't known how to address it appropriately. "People sometimes carry heavy hearts, George," she replied gently, "even when they're doing important work that requires them to appear strong." The prince nodded thoughtfully, filing this wisdom away as they continued their walk. Later that day, George found himself thinking about Thomas while attending his private tutoring sessions. His governess noticed his distraction and asked what was troubling him. George explained his observations about the Royal Guard, his words careful and respectful. The governess was struck by the young prince's empathy and emotional intelligence. That evening, George approached his father, Prince William, with an unusual request. He wanted to learn more about the people who worked at the castle, their lives beyond their duties. William was initially surprised but then proud of his son's growing awareness of others' needs. They agreed that George could spend some time with the head of security to better understand the challenges faced by the castle's staff. The head of security, Colonel James Morrison, was impressed by the young prince's genuine concern. During their meeting, he shared general information about the pressures faced by royal guards, the long hours, the physical demands, and the emotional toll of maintaining perfect composure at all times. George listened intently, his understanding deepening with each revelation. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his daily routine, unaware that his quiet suffering had been noticed by the youngest member of the royal family. He stood at his post, shoulders straight, eyes forward, maintaining the centuries-old tradition of the Royal Guard. Tourists snapped photos, children waved, and life at the castle continued as it always had. But something was shifting in the young prince's heart. George had begun to understand that true nobility wasn't just about titles and ceremonies. It was about recognizing the humanity in others and finding ways to help when help was needed. His great-grandmother's lessons about leadership were taking root in unexpected ways. As the days passed, George's observations became more focused. He noticed that Thomas seemed most tired on Monday mornings, suggesting difficult weekends. He saw how the guard's uniform, though impeccable, sometimes showed signs of being quickly pressed, indicating rushed preparations. Most telling of all, he observed the brief moments when Thomas's professional mask slipped, revealing glimpses of profound sadness. The young prince was forming a plan, though he didn't yet know what shape it would take. He had learned from his family that with privilege came responsibility, and he felt responsible for somehow helping this man who served his family with such dedication. The seeds of an idea were beginning to grow in his mind, an idea that would soon change both his life and Thomas's in ways neither could imagine. The castle grounds that evening were quiet, except for the soft footsteps of the changing guard. Thomas handed over his post to the night watch, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. As he walked toward the staff quarters, he had no idea that a 10-year-old prince was watching from a window above, already planning how to help a man who had given so much in service to others. The stage was set for an extraordinary act of compassion that would ripple through the halls of Windsor Castle and touch hearts far beyond its ancient walls. Prince George's quiet observation was about to become the catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the most profound impact on someone's life. 3 weeks had passed since Prince George first noticed Thomas's struggles, and his curiosity had transformed into genuine concern. The young prince had developed a routine of timing his daily activities to coincide with moments when he could observe the royal guard without seeming intrusive. What he discovered during these careful observations troubled his young heart deeply. On a particularly gray Tuesday morning, George witnessed something that would forever change his perspective. While walking through the castle gardens with his tutor, he saw Thomas during his brief break between shifts. The guard was sitting alone on a stone bench behind the service quarters, his head buried in his hands. His shoulders shook slightly, and George realized with a shock that this strong, dignified man was crying. The sight struck George like a physical blow. He had never seen an adult man cry before, especially not someone who seemed as unbreakable as Thomas. The young prince felt a mixture of sadness and confusion, unsure how to process what he had witnessed. His tutor, following George's gaze, quickly guided him away from the scene, but the image remained burned in the prince's memory. That afternoon, George made a decision that would surprise his family. He asked to speak privately with his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, about something important. The Queen, recognizing the serious tone in her great-grandson's voice, agreed to meet with him in her private study after tea. The conversation that followed was unlike any the Queen had experienced with George before. The young prince spoke with a maturity beyond his years, describing his observations of Thomas with remarkable detail and sensitivity. He explained how he had noticed the guard's increasing fatigue, the moments of vulnerability, and most importantly, the incident he had witnessed that morning. Queen Elizabeth listened carefully, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail George shared. She had always known her great-grandson was special, but his emotional intelligence and capacity for empathy impressed her deeply. When George finished speaking, the Queen remained quiet for several moments, considering both the situation and her response. "George," she said finally, "what you've observed shows great wisdom and compassion, but we must be very careful about how we proceed. Thomas is a proud man who has served our family with distinction. Any help we offer must preserve his dignity." The young prince nodded eagerly, grateful that his grandmother was taking his concerns seriously. The Queen made some discreet inquiries through Colonel Morrison, learning the heartbreaking details of Thomas's situation. Sarah's condition had worsened significantly in recent months. She now required round-the-clock care, and the costs were overwhelming Thomas's modest salary. Even with his additional work, the guard had been quietly liquidating his personal possessions to cover expenses, selling everything from family heirlooms to his late father's watch collection. More troubling still was the toll the situation was taking on Thomas's own health. He had lost significant weight. His blood pressure had spiked dangerously high during his last medical examination, and his supervisor had begun to worry about his ability to continue his duties safely. Thomas had requested no special treatment, asking only that his personal situation remain private. George's heart ached when his grandmother shared these details with him. The young prince struggled to understand how someone who gave so much to others could suffer so quietly and alone. It seemed fundamentally unfair that Thomas's loyalty and service had not protected him from such devastating personal tragedy. The Queen explained to George that there were protocols and procedures that governed how the royal family could help their staff. Direct financial assistance, while well-intentioned, could create uncomfortable dynamics and potentially embarrass the recipient. However, there were other ways to help that might be more appropriate and effective. Over the following days, George found himself paying even closer attention to Thomas during his duties. The guard's professionalism never wavered, but the signs of strain were becoming more apparent to those who knew what to look for. His usual quick step had slowed slightly, and his responses to routine interactions seemed more mechanical than before. During one particularly difficult afternoon, George watched as Thomas received a phone call during his break. Even from a distance, the prince could see the guard's face crumple as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When the call ended, Thomas sat motionless for several minutes before slowly standing and returning to his post, his composure restored but his eyes reflecting deep pain. That evening, George couldn't concentrate on his studies or his usual activities. His mother, Catherine, noticed his distraction during dinner and gently inquired about what was troubling him. George found himself sharing the full story, explaining his observations and his growing desire to help Thomas in some meaningful way. Princess Catherine was moved by her son's compassion and impressed by his thoughtful approach to the situation. She had always taught her children to be aware of others' needs and to use their privilege responsibly, but seeing George apply these lessons so naturally filled her with pride. She promised to speak with Prince William about the situation and explore appropriate ways the family might offer support. The conversation between George's parents that night was emotional and productive. Both William and Catherine recognized that their son had identified a genuine crisis affecting someone who had devoted his life to serving their family. They agreed that finding a way to help Thomas was not only the right thing to do, but also an important lesson for George about leadership and responsibility. Word of Thomas's situation, shared discreetly among senior palace staff, revealed that he was not alone in facing personal challenges. Several other long-serving staff members had been quietly struggling with various difficulties, from medical bills to family crises. George's observations had inadvertently highlighted a broader issue about how the royal household cared for its most loyal employees. As the week ended, Thomas continued his duties with the same dedication he had shown for 15 years, unaware that his quiet suffering had been noticed and that wheels were already in motion to help him. The young prince who watched him with such concern was learning valuable lessons about the complexity of helping others while preserving their dignity. The stage was set for George to take action, but the form that action would take was still evolving. What was clear was that the 10-year-old prince had been profoundly affected by witnessing Thomas's pain and was determined to find a way to help, regardless of how challenging or unconventional that help might need to be. Prince George had always been taught that action spoke louder than words, and as he lay awake in his bedroom at Windsor Castle, staring at the ceiling, he knew that simply observing Thomas's pain was no longer enough. The young prince had been wrestling with ideas for days, rejecting each one as either too complicated, too obvious, or potentially embarrassing for the proud guard. The breakthrough came during his weekly visit to the local village with his protection officer. George had insisted on stopping at the small charity shop that his great-grandmother often supported, claiming he wanted to look for a book. While browsing the shelves, he overheard a conversation between two elderly volunteers discussing a family whose medical expenses had been covered by an anonymous donor. The beautiful thing, one woman said to the other, was that they never knew who helped them. No awkwardness, no feeling like they owed anyone anything, just the bills disappearing and a note saying someone cared. George's ears perked up at this, and suddenly he knew exactly what he needed to do. On the ride back to the castle, George was unusually quiet, his mind racing with possibilities. His protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, noticed his contemplative mood but respected his privacy. She had worked with the young prince long enough to recognize when he was processing something important. That evening, George approached his father with a request that surprised Prince William. The 10-year-old wanted to access his personal trust fund, the money set aside for his future education and expenses. More specifically, he wanted to use a significant portion of it to help Thomas anonymously. William's first instinct was to discourage such a large financial gesture, but something in his son's earnest expression made him pause. "Tell me exactly what you're thinking, George," William said, settling into a chair across from his son in the castle's private sitting room. The fire crackled warmly as George carefully explained his plan. He had calculated that covering Sarah's medical expenses and facility costs for 2 years would give Thomas breathing room to focus on his job and his own health without the crushing financial pressure. George had thought through the logistics with impressive thoroughness for someone his age. The donation would be handled through a legal firm that specialized in anonymous charitable giving. A letter would accompany the payment, explaining that Thomas's years of dedicated service had been noticed and appreciated by someone who preferred to remain unnamed. "But George," William said gently, "this is a substantial amount of money. Are you certain this is how you want to use it?" The young prince nodded without hesitation. He explained that he had everything he needed and more, while Thomas was losing everything he loved despite working harder than anyone George knew. The conversation continued for over an hour, with William probing his son's motivations and understanding. He was struck by George's mature reasoning and his clear grasp of the situation's complexity. The young prince understood that money alone wouldn't heal Sarah's condition, but it would remove the additional suffering caused by financial worry. William agreed to help facilitate the donation, but with conditions. George would need to discuss the plan with his mother and grandmother, and they would need to ensure that the gesture truly remained anonymous to protect both Thomas's privacy and the family's relationship with their staff. The next morning, George presented his plan to Queen Elizabeth II during their regular breakfast meeting. The Queen listened intently as her great-grandson explained his reasoning, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about his motivations and expectations. She was particularly interested in his understanding of why anonymity was crucial. "Thomas is proud Gangan," George said, using his private nickname for his great-grandmother. "If he knew it came from us, he might feel like he had to quit his job or act differently around us. But if he doesn't know, then nothing has to change except that he won't be so worried about money." Queen Elizabeth was deeply moved by George's wisdom and compassion. In her many decades of life, she had learned that true generosity often required careful consideration of the recipient's feelings and dignity. Her 10-year-old great-grandson seemed to understand this instinctively. The plan required several weeks to implement properly. The royal family's legal team worked with a respected London firm that specialized in confidential charitable giving. They established a carefully constructed paper trail that would make it nearly impossible to trace the donation back to George or the royal family. During this time, George continued to observe Thomas during his daily routines. The guard's condition seemed to be worsening slightly, though he never let it affect his professional performance. George noticed that Thomas had started bringing packed lunches to work, instead of purchasing food from the castle's staff dining room. Another small sign of his financial struggles. One particularly difficult day, George witnessed Thomas receiving another distressing phone call during his break. This time, the guard's composure cracked more visibly, and he had to take several minutes to collect himself before returning to his post. The young prince felt a surge of urgency, hoping their plan would be implemented soon. Princess Catherine had initially been concerned about the size of George's proposed donation, but after several family discussions, she came to support her son's decision. She was impressed by his thoughtfulness and his clear understanding of the responsibility that came with privilege. The gesture, she realized, was teaching George valuable lessons about using resources to help others effectively. The legal arrangements were finalized on a crisp autumn morning. George signed the necessary documents with a seriousness that impressed the solicitors handling the transaction. He had insisted on writing the accompanying letter himself, though his parents helped him refine the language to ensure it struck the right tone. The letter was simple and heartfelt. "Your years of dedicated service have been noticed and deeply appreciated by someone who wishes to remain anonymous. Please accept this assistance as a small token of gratitude for your loyalty and professionalism. Your dignity and strength have been an inspiration to others, even when you thought no one was watching." As the papers were processed and the funds transferred, George felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He had committed a significant portion of his future to helping someone he barely knew personally, but had come to care about deeply through his observations. The young prince understood that this gesture would likely remain secret forever, that he would never receive thanks or recognition for what he had done. But as he watched Thomas standing at his post that afternoon, shoulders straight despite the invisible weight he carried, George felt a peace he had never experienced before. Soon that weight would be lightened, and while Thomas might never know who had helped him, George would have the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had used his privilege to ease another person's suffering. The donation would be delivered within the week, and George could hardly contain his anticipation for Thomas's reaction. He had no idea that his anonymous act of kindness was about to set in motion a series of events that would profoundly impact not just Thomas's life, but his own understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. The Tuesday morning that would change Thomas Whitman's life forever began like any other. He arrived at Windsor Castle at dawn, his uniform pressed to perfection despite having stayed up late the previous night reviewing medical bills and insurance papers. Sarah's care facility had sent another notice about increasing costs, and Thomas had spent hours trying to figure out how to manage the additional expenses. As he took his position at the castle's main entrance, Thomas felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. The double shifts were taking their toll, and his supervisor had started making subtle comments about his appearance. Thomas knew he was walking a thin line between maintaining his professional standards and simply surviving each day. Prince George, as had become his habit, positioned himself at the library window where he could observe Thomas's post. The young prince had been almost unable to sleep the night before, knowing that today was the day the solicitors would deliver the anonymous donation. His stomach churned with nervous excitement as he watched Thomas assume his stoic stance. At precisely 11 o'clock, a well-dressed gentleman approached Thomas with an official-looking envelope. The guard maintained his professional demeanor while accepting the delivery, though George could see confusion flicker across his features. Protocol dictated that Thomas couldn't open personal correspondence while on duty, so he carefully tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket. The next 4 hours felt like an eternity to George. He attended his morning lessons with his tutor, but his mind kept wandering to Thomas and the life-changing news that waited in that envelope. His governess noticed his distraction and asked if he was feeling unwell. George assured her he was fine, though his heart was racing with anticipation. When Thomas's shift ended at 3 o'clock, George positioned himself discreetly in the castle's east corridor, where he could observe the guard's route to the staff quarters. Thomas walked with his usual measured pace, but George noticed him patting his jacket pocket several times, clearly curious about the mysterious delivery. Thomas entered the staff break room, which was mercifully empty during the afternoon shift change. He removed the envelope with careful hands, noting the expensive paper and the formal legal seal. His name was written in elegant script across the front, along with personal and confidential in bold letters. Inside, Thomas found a cashier's check for an amount that made him read the numbers 3 times to ensure he wasn't hallucinating. The sum was enough to cover Sarah's medical expenses for the next 2 years, with additional funds for her continued care. Attached was the letter George had written, expressing gratitude for Thomas's service and explaining that the gift came from someone who had noticed his dedication and strength. Thomas's hands began to shake as the reality of what he was holding sank in. For a moment he wondered if this was some kind of mistake or cruel joke, but the legal letterhead and professional presentation suggested otherwise. He read the letter again, his eyes filling with tears as the words, "Your dignity and strength have been an inspiration to others," resonated deeply. From his concealed position, George watched as Thomas sank into a chair, his usual perfect posture forgotten. The guard's shoulders began to shake, and George realized that Thomas was crying again, but these tears were different from the ones he had witnessed weeks earlier. These tears carried relief and hope rather than despair. Thomas remained in the break room for nearly 20 minutes, alternately staring at the check and rereading the letter. He called the legal firm listed on the letterhead to verify the donation's authenticity, speaking in hushed tones with someone who confirmed that the funds were legitimate and immediately available. The transformation in Thomas was visible even from George's distant vantage point. The guard's posture straightened, and for the first time in months his face showed something other than carefully controlled pain. When he finally stood to leave the break room, his step had a lightness that George hadn't seen since he first began observing the man. That evening, Thomas called the care facility where Sarah lived, his voice stronger and more confident than it had been in years. He arranged to increase her level of care, adding therapies and programs that he had previously been unable to afford. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, Thomas felt hope that he could provide her with the dignity and comfort she deserved. George watched from his bedroom window as Thomas walked across the castle grounds that evening, and even in the darkness the change in the guard's demeanor was apparent. There was purpose in his stride, and his head was held high with a pride that came from knowing his beloved wife would be properly cared for. The young prince felt a warmth spreading through his chest that he had never experienced before. He had learned about charity and giving from his family, but this was the first time he had witnessed the direct impact of his actions on another person's life. The knowledge that Thomas's burden had been lightened filled George with a profound sense of satisfaction. Over the following days, the changes in Thomas became more pronounced. His colleagues noticed that he seemed more energetic, more present during conversations. The tired lines around his eyes began to fade, and his famous attention to detail, which had slipped slightly in recent weeks, returned to its usual perfection. Colonel Morrison, the head of security, was particularly struck by the change. He had been considering whether to recommend that Thomas take extended leave to address his obvious health concerns, but suddenly those concerns seemed to be resolving themselves. Morrison wondered what had happened but respected Thomas's privacy too much to pry. Prince George found himself studying Thomas's face during their daily encounters, memorizing every sign of the guard's improved condition. The young prince had learned the profound lesson that sometimes the most meaningful gestures were those that remained forever secret. He would never receive thanks from Thomas, never be acknowledged for his generosity, but the sight of the guard's renewed strength was reward enough. The anonymous donation had accomplished exactly what George had hoped. Thomas's dignity remained intact because he didn't know who had helped him, and their relationship was unchanged. But the crushing weight of financial worry had been lifted, allowing Thomas to focus on his duties and his wife's care, without the constant stress that had been slowly destroying his health. As George drifted off to sleep that night, he thought about his great-grandmother's words about true leadership requiring the ability to see what others tried to hide. He had seen Thomas's hidden pain and found a way to address it, without compromising the guard's pride or professionalism. The 10-year-old prince was beginning to understand that real power lay not in commanding others, but in quietly improving their lives when they needed it most. The first phase of George's plan had succeeded beyond his expectations, but he had no idea that Thomas was about to make a decision that would surprise everyone at Windsor Castle and create ripple effects far beyond what the young prince had ever imagined. 3 weeks after receiving the anonymous donation, Thomas Whitman made a decision that shocked everyone at Windsor Castle. He submitted his resignation from the Royal Guard, effective in 30 days, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue new opportunities that would allow him to spend more time with his family. The news rippled through the castle staff like wildfire. Thomas had been a fixture at Windsor for 15 years, and many couldn't imagine the place without his steady presence. Colonel Morrison was particularly stunned, as Thomas had shown such marked improvement recently that Morrison had assumed whatever personal issues he'd been facing were resolving themselves. Prince George learned of Thomas's resignation during breakfast with his grandmother, and the news hit him like a physical blow. Queen Elizabeth noticed her great-grandson's distressed expression as she shared what she had learned from Colonel Morrison about Thomas's unexpected announcement. "But why would he leave now?" George asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He seems so much better lately." The Queen studied her great-grandson's face carefully, noting the depth of his concern for a staff member he supposedly barely knew. "Sometimes, George," the Queen said gently, "when people's circumstances change, it allows them to make choices they couldn't make before. Perhaps Thomas has found an opportunity that better suits his current needs." But even as she spoke these words, the Queen found herself puzzled by the timing of Thomas's decision. George excused himself from breakfast early and spent the morning pacing his room, trying to understand what had gone wrong. His anonymous gift was supposed to make Thomas's life easier, not cause him to leave his job. The young prince wondered if somehow Thomas had discovered the source of the donation and felt he had to resign to avoid any awkwardness. That afternoon, George positioned himself in his usual observation spot, determined to study Thomas for any clues about his decision. What he saw confused him even more. Thomas appeared more relaxed and confident than he had in months. There was a lightness in his step and a clarity in his eyes that suggested someone who had made a difficult, but ultimately positive decision. During his afternoon break, Thomas was approached by several of his colleagues who had heard about his resignation. George watched as the conversations unfolded, noting that Thomas seemed genuinely happy to discuss his future plans, though his words were too distant for the prince to hear clearly. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, Thomas's immediate supervisor, had requested a private meeting with him to understand his decision better. Thomas explained that the anonymous donation had given him something he hadn't had in years: choices. With Sarah's medical expenses secured, he could consider opportunities that paid less but offered more meaningful work. "I've been offered a position with a veterans charity," Thomas explained to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. "It's work that feels like a true calling, helping other service members who are struggling with personal challenges. The pay is modest, but for the first time in years, that's not the primary consideration." Thomas went on to explain that his years of military and royal service had given him unique insights into the challenges faced by service members and their families. The anonymous benefactor had unknowingly freed him to pursue work that aligned with his values and desire to help others who faced similar struggles to his own. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was moved by Thomas's explanation and impressed by his thoughtful approach to this career transition. She had always known Thomas to be conscientious and dedicated, but seeing him speak about his future with such passion and clarity revealed depth she hadn't fully appreciated. Meanwhile, Prince George was struggling to process what he was learning about Thomas's decision. During his evening meal with his parents, he finally broke down and shared his confusion about why his gift had led to Thomas's resignation, rather than making his life easier. Prince William and Princess Catherine exchanged glances, realizing that their son was learning a complex lesson about unintended consequences. William sat down beside George and explained that sometimes helping someone didn't lead to the outcomes you expected, but that didn't make the help any less valuable. "Thomas is making this choice because you gave him the freedom to choose," William explained. "Before your gift, he was trapped by circumstances. Now he can follow his heart instead of just surviving day by day." This perspective hadn't occurred to George, and he found himself considering the situation from an entirely different angle. Over the following days, George paid even closer attention to Thomas, trying to understand the man's mindset. What he observed gradually shifted his understanding of the situation. Thomas wasn't leaving because he was unhappy or because he'd discovered the source of the donation. He was leaving because, for the first time in years, he could afford to pursue work that fulfilled him rather than just paying the bills. The young prince began to realize that his gift had been even more successful than he'd originally hoped. He hadn't just solved Thomas's immediate financial crisis. He had restored the man's sense of agency and hope for the future. Thomas was leaving the Royal Guard not as a broken man fleeing his problems, but as someone empowered to make positive changes in his life. During Thomas's final week at Windsor Castle, George made a point of being visible during the guard shifts, wanting to observe this transition as closely as possible. He noticed that Thomas's interactions with his colleagues were warmer and more open than they had been in months. The man seemed to be saying goodbye with genuine affection, rather than the desperation that might have characterized his departure under different circumstances. Colonel Morrison organized a small farewell gathering for Thomas, recognizing his years of dedicated service. George watched from a distance as Thomas's colleagues praised his professionalism and expressed their best wishes for his future endeavors. The genuine warmth of these interactions told George that Thomas was leaving on good terms, with his reputation and relationships intact. On Thomas's final day, the guard performed his duties with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire tenure at Windsor Castle. But there was something different in his bearing, a sense of completion rather than merely ending. He was finishing this chapter of his life with dignity and purpose, ready to begin the next. That evening, as Thomas walked across the castle grounds for the last time as a royal guard, Prince George watched from his bedroom window with mixed emotions. He felt sadness at losing this man who had unknowingly taught him so much about quiet strength and dedication, but he also felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that his anonymous gift had given Thomas the freedom to choose his own path forward. The 10-year-old prince was learning that true Generosity sometimes meant letting go of your expectations about outcomes. He had hoped to make Thomas's life easier, and he had succeeded, but not in the way he had imagined. Instead of keeping Thomas at Windsor Castle, his gift had empowered the man to leave and pursue work that would bring him greater fulfillment and allow him to help others facing similar struggles. As George prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the unexpected lessons this experience had taught him about the complexity of helping others and the importance of respecting their autonomy to make their own choices, even when those choices were different from what you might have expected or wanted. 2 months after Thomas Whitman left Windsor Castle to begin his new career with the Veterans Charity, Prince George received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Morrison approached the young prince during his morning walk, carrying a sealed envelope that bore George's name in unfamiliar handwriting. "Your Highness," Colonel Morrison said with his usual formal bearing, "this arrived for you through official channels. The sender requested it be delivered to you personally." George accepted the envelope with curiosity, noting the careful script and the slightly worn paper that suggested it had traveled some distance. Back in the privacy of his room, George opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter that made his heart race with excitement and nervousness. It was from Thomas Whitman, and the first few lines made it clear that the former Royal Guard had somehow connected George to the anonymous donation that had changed his life. "Your Royal Highness," the letter began, "I hope you will forgive the liberty I'm taking in writing to you directly, but recent events have led me to believe that you may have had a role in the extraordinary gift I received during my final weeks at Windsor Castle." George's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. Thomas explained that his new work with the Veterans Charity had given him insights into anonymous giving and the legal mechanisms used to protect donors' identities. While working on a case involving a service member's family who had received similar help, Thomas had noticed striking parallels to his own situation. The language in the accompanying letter, the timing, and certain specific phrases had triggered his memory. The letter that accompanied my gift mentioned that my dignity and strength had been an inspiration to others, even when I thought no one was watching, Thomas had written to George. "It wasn't until I began working with other families in crisis that I realized how unusual it was for someone to notice such specific details about a person's struggle. It suggested someone who had been observing with great care and compassion." George felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and worry. Had he been too obvious in his observations? Had his attempt at anonymity failed completely? He continued reading, anxious to understand how Thomas had connected him to the donation. Thomas's letter went on to describe a conversation with Colonel Morrison about notable changes in palace dynamics during his final months of service. Morrison had mentioned in passing young Prince George's unusual interest in the welfare of castle staff and his mature questions about the challenges faced by royal guards. These comments, combined with Thomas's growing suspicions about the donation, had led him to piece together the truth. "I want you to know," Thomas wrote, "that discovering your role in this gift has not diminished my gratitude, but rather increased my amazement at your compassion and wisdom. That someone so young would notice an adult's quiet struggles and find a way to help without seeking recognition demonstrates a character that gives me great hope for the future." George felt a mixture of relief and nervousness as he read these words. Thomas wasn't angry about the breach of anonymity, but George worried about what this revelation might mean for their relationship and for his family's position with former staff members. The letter continued with Thomas sharing details about his new life and work that filled George's heart with joy. Sarah's condition had stabilized somewhat with the enhanced care she was now receiving, and while she still didn't recognize Thomas, she seemed more comfortable and peaceful. Thomas had been able to visit her every day since leaving Windsor Castle, something that had been impossible when he was working double shifts. More importantly, Thomas's work with the Veterans Charity was proving deeply fulfilling. He had helped 12 families navigate medical crises similar to his own, using his experience and connections to secure support and resources. Several families had received anonymous assistance similar to what Thomas had experienced, though he had no way of knowing whether these gifts came from the same source. "Your gift didn't just save my family's financial security," Thomas wrote. "It gave me the freedom to dedicate my life to helping others who face similar challenges. In a very real sense, your compassion has multiplied, touching lives you may never know about." George felt tears, welling up in his eyes as he absorbed the full impact of what Thomas was sharing. The letter took an unexpected turn as Thomas described a specific case that had brought George to mind. A young veteran's family had been struggling with their child's medical expenses when they received an anonymous donation identical in structure and presentation to Thomas's gift. The accompanying letter contained similar language about noticing someone's strength during difficult times. I began to wonder, Thomas wrote, whether the person who helped me might be helping others as well. If so, I wanted you to know that your kindness is creating ripple effects that reach far beyond what you might have imagined. George's mind raced as he considered the implications of Thomas's observations. The letter concluded with Thomas expressing his deep gratitude and respect for George's character. He promised to maintain discretion about George's role in his situation, but wanted the young prince to know that his actions had inspired Thomas to approach his own charitable work with even greater dedication and sensitivity. You taught me that true generosity requires not just resources, but wisdom about how to give in ways that preserve dignity and empower recipients to make their own choices, Thomas wrote. I try to apply this lesson in every family I work with, and I believe it makes me more effective in helping others. George read the letter 3 times before finally setting it aside, his mind swirling with emotions and thoughts. He felt embarrassed that his anonymity had been compromised, but also deeply moved by Thomas's words about the broader impact of his gift. The idea that his actions might have inspired others to give, or helped Thomas become better at helping others, hadn't occurred to him. That evening, George shared Thomas's letter with his parents, explaining his mixed feelings about the situation. Prince William and Princess Catherine were impressed by both Thomas's discretion in approaching George directly, and his insights about the ripple effects of charitable giving. This is what happens when you plant seeds of kindness, George, his mother explained gently. They grow in ways you never expect, often bearing fruit in places you never imagined. The young prince found comfort in this perspective, beginning to see Thomas's discovery not as a failure of his plan, but as evidence of its success. As George fell asleep that night, he thought about Thomas working with other families in crisis, using the lessons learned from his own experience to help them more effectively. The knowledge that his anonymous gift had not only solved Thomas's immediate problems, but had also equipped him to be a better helper to others filled the young prince with a profound sense of satisfaction and purpose. 1 year after Thomas Whitman left Windsor Castle, Prince George received another letter that would profoundly shape his understanding of leadership and service. This time, the envelope came through the Veterans Charity where Thomas worked, and it contained not just a personal note, but also a detailed report about the program Thomas had developed, based on the principles he had learned from George's anonymous gift. The program, called Quiet Heroes, focused on identifying and supporting service members and their families who were struggling in silence, much as Thomas had done. The approach emphasized preserving dignity through anonymous assistance and creating pathways for recipients to eventually help others facing similar challenges. In its first year, the program had helped over 50 families and had inspired 3 other veterans organizations to adopt similar models. Your Royal Highness, Thomas's letter began, I wanted to share with you the remarkable growth that has stemmed from the seed of compassion you planted. The principles you demonstrated, observing with care, acting with discretion, and empowering rather than just assisting, have become the foundation for something much larger than either of us initially imagined. George, now 11 and growing in wisdom and stature, read the report with fascination. Thomas had documented case studies of families helped through the program, each one following the model of anonymous support that preserved dignity while providing crucial assistance. The young prince was amazed to see how his simple act of kindness had evolved into a systematic approach to helping others. What moved George most deeply was Thomas's description of how the program's recipients were encouraged to eventually become helpers themselves. Several families who had been assisted during their darkest hours had gone on to identify and support other struggling families, creating an ever-expanding network of quiet compassion. The letter revealed that Thomas had shared George's story, without naming him directly, as inspiration for the program's volunteers. He described a young person of privilege who had noticed suffering that others overlooked and found a way to help that honored the recipient's dignity. This story had become legendary among the charity's workers, inspiring them to approach their own giving with similar thoughtfulness and humility. George brought Thomas's letter to his weekly meeting with Queen Elizabeth II, sharing both his pride in the program's success and his continuing amazement at the unintended consequences of his original gift. The Queen read the report carefully, her expression reflecting deep satisfaction with her great-grandson's early demonstration of true leadership. "George," she said when she finished reading, "this is what authentic leadership looks like. It's not about commanding attention or receiving credit. It's about identifying problems others haven't noticed and solving them in ways that empower others to continue the work." The young prince nodded, beginning to understand how his private act of kindness connected to the larger responsibilities he would one day inherit. The report included a section that particularly touched George's heart. Thomas had described his visits with Sarah, explaining how the enhanced care made possible by the anonymous donation had given them precious moments of connection, even as her condition continued to decline. While she rarely recognized him anymore, Thomas treasured the times when she seemed peaceful and comfortable, knowing that her dignity was being preserved during her most vulnerable period. More significantly, Thomas had established a support group for spouses and family members of people with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. Drawing from his own experience of carrying that burden alone for so long, he had created a space where people could share their struggles without judgment and receive practical assistance navigating the complex medical and financial challenges they faced. The letter concluded with news that surprised and delighted George. Thomas had been invited to speak at a national conference on Veterans Affairs, where he would present the Quiet Heroes model to charitable organizations across the country. The principles that had grown from George's anonymous gift were potentially going to influence how charitable giving was approached on a much larger scale. "I often wonder," Thomas wrote, "whether that young person who started all of this realizes how far their compassion has traveled. They taught me that the most powerful gifts are those that enable recipients to become givers themselves. And that lesson has touched hundreds of lives now, with the potential to touch thousands more." Reading these words, George felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than himself. He had learned that leadership wasn't just about making decisions or giving commands, but about planting seeds of positive change that could grow far beyond his original intentions or imagination. That evening, George sat with his parents in the castle's library, sharing his thoughts about Thomas's letter and the remarkable journey that had begun with his simple observation of a struggling guard. Prince William was struck by his son's mature reflection on the experience and his growing understanding of the responsibility that came with privilege. "What you've learned, George," William said, "is that true service often happens quietly and without recognition. The most important changes you'll make as a leader may be ones that no one ever connects to you directly, but that improve lives and inspire others to do the same." Princess Catherine added her own perspective, noting how George's experience with Thomas had shaped his interactions with others throughout the past year.
He had become more observant of people's struggles and more creative in finding ways to help without drawing attention to himself. As the months that followed brought George closer to his 12th birthday,
he continued to receive periodic updates from Thomas about the growth of the Quiet Heroes program. Each report brought new stories of families helped, volunteers inspired, and the ripple effects of compassion spreading through communities across the country. The young prince had learned that true leadership meant creating positive change that could survive and grow beyond his direct involvement. His anonymous gift to Thomas had become something much larger, a movement based on the principles of dignified giving and empowering recipients to help others. Years later, as Prince George grew into his role as a future king, he would carry with him the lessons learned from that quiet act of compassion toward a struggling royal guard. He had discovered that the most powerful leadership often happened in moments when no one was watching, and that the greatest gifts were those that enabled others to become givers themselves. Thomas Whitman's decision to step down from the royal guard, initially so puzzling to young George, had become the catalyst for a movement that embodied the best principles of service and leadership. The boy who had simply noticed one man's quiet suffering had learned how individual acts of kindness could become forces for widespread positive change, a lesson that would guide him throughout his life and eventual reign.